Hello, and welcome to my presentation, Shucks, an archaeological investigation of a possible oyster vessel wrecked in Washington, North Carolina. My name is Patrick Boyle, and I will be discussing the history of North Carolina's oyster industry, as well as the vessel types used in the trade. To begin, I will be examining a shipwreck located at the start of the Pamlico River at Washington for my thesis project within the program in Maritime Studies at East Carolina University. The site, designated PMR 0062, is a centerboard vessel that has similar features to the vessels used in the late 19th to early 20th century oyster industry. The research questions that will be addressed in the project include: 1. What are the origins of Site PMR 0062? Can its vessel type be identified from an archaeological survey? 2. What historic fishing industries operated in and around Washington, North Carolina? Where do these fisheries fit within the historical narrative of North Carolina's maritime history? And 3. Have environmental processes and cultural activities affected Site PMR 0062? Is physical evidence of those impacts visible at the site? The North Carolina oyster industry was important to the small coastal towns of eastern North Carolina. Native Americans as well as early settlers used oysters as a reliable food source. However, the oyster industry never expanded as large as the oyster industries of the North, such as in the Chesapeake Bay region. The reason for this is because of the distances between these small towns and the much larger inland cities. Fast and reliable transportation had not yet been established from the coastal North Carolina towns. However, during the late 19th century, North Carolina saw a rapid expansion in their oyster industry when oysters from the Chesapeake Bay region congregated to North Carolina estuaries in search of oysters. They did this because the Chesapeake Bay was quickly becoming overfished from advanced fishing techniques and vessel types. The Chesapeake Bay oysterers came to North Carolina and not only influenced the oyster industry of the state, but also the ship types used within the area. The northern oyster industry influence can be seen in Washington's history. Around 1890, an oyster canning factory opened in the town that employed over 150 people. The business was very successful, and oyster shells were so prevalent in Washington that they literally had to burn them to get rid of them. The streets were surfaced with shells, and a massive lime kiln was built on the island in the river. The townspeople thought the kiln funnels made the island look like a castle, and the island was named the Castle, and it is still referred to as such today. The J.S. Farron and Company Canning House was Washington's oystering facility. It was located on Water Street next to the J.R. Farrow Shipyard, where Festival Park and the estuarium are presently located. Two maps of the waterfront are depicted here. The one on the left is from 1891 and 1911 on the right. A 1909 issue of the Washington Daily News had an article discussing a visit from a representative of the company visiting the J.S. Farron and Company branch at Washington. At this point in time, the factory had been shut down for 2 years. The article suggests that nearly 200 people were working for this facility, but they would need assurances that enough oysters would be caught to justify the reopening. A 1916 issue of the same newspaper contains an article discussing the effects the facility had on the oyster population. The article mentions at least 4 boats being docked at the facility to offload oysters. The author claimed that the rate at which the oystermen were going, it would not be long until the oyster beds are entirely depleted. Unfortunately, the Chesapeake Bay oysters did not learn from their previous mistakes, and the Pamlico Sound was also overfished. The most important piece of equipment in the oyster industry were the ships used to collect the oysters. The ships began as dugout canoes, and the oysters used hand tongs to scoop up oysters from the seabed. Over time, the ships became larger and were specifically created to use advanced fishing methods such as dredging. The picture shows a bugeye named Edna E. Lockwood, which is located at the Chesapeake Bay Maritime Museum. It is one of the only surviving bugeyes left and has been heavily restored multiple times. The centerboard wreck was one of the main sites used for ECU's program in Maritime Studies 2020 Fall Field School. Originally, the site was going to be used for students to practice basic surveying techniques. However, the site offered more extant remains than previously thought, and a more in-depth survey was completed. Here you can see divers on the left where the stem is, and more divers on the right where the stern is. The ship itself is 15.6 meters, 51 feet long, and roughly 5 meters, 16 feet wide. I unfortunately cannot show you pictures of the wreck because visibility is so low in the river, but the shipwreck remains consist of the stem, stern, centerboard case, frames, outer and inner hull planking. We also found the lower remains of a mast and a large portion of the rudder. To map the wreck, we set a baseline and measured from that to different points of the wreck. Here you can see an image of divers taking offset measurements. The data that was collected is still being processed. This is a work in progress plan of the site. The stem or bow is on the right, the stern is on the left, as well as the remains of the rudder. The centerboard case is in the middle, and just above that is where the mast is located. The X's are frame stations, and the dashed lines are inner and outer hull planking. The site plan will help determine the possible vessel type by comparing it to known vessels from the historical record. Considering that the Chesapeake Bay bugeye type measured anywhere from 40 to 80 feet in length, this vessel fits well within that range. The vessel appears to have a slow curved hull similar to a bugeye, rather than a sharp chine seen in later oyster vessels such as the skipjack. Even though the wreck has similar characteristics of a bugeye, it is possible that the wreck could be a local variation of this Chesapeake Bay type. A variety of oyster vessel types were used in North Carolina's oyster industry during the 19th and 20th centuries, and though bugeyes were indeed used on the Pamlico River, a survey of the shipwreck site is not enough to determine the exact type. The obtained data of the shipwreck must now be compared to historical documents of the ship types used in North Carolina and the Chesapeake Bay oyster industries. A total of 35 artifacts were found within the site. They were measured, sketched, photographed, and replaced back on site where they were found. Many of these artifacts are relatable to the oyster industry. I will show a few examples starting with the small amount of oyster shells that were found in between ceiling planking and outer hull planking. These were the only oyster shells located on the wreck. Next we have an oyster dredge rake. This toothed rod would be placed at the bottom of the dredge so that it would drag along the seafloor, trapping oysters within a net. Here is an example of what the dredge would have looked like. The netting would have been extended over the entire frame. And here's a closer look. It is very similar to the artifact, though the dredges came in a variety of different sizes. Next we have what appears to be a small foot from an iron cooking stove. These stoves were common on oystering vessels, and the image on right is of a stove used on a bugeye. This next artifact is probably a vertical roller, which was used on oyster vessels to keep the dredge cable from scraping against the wooden hull of the ship. These are most likely a set of ice tongs. Ice was used to keep fish and oysters from spoiling on longer journeys. Multiple aspects of this project are historically significant. First, since the North Carolina oyster industry, particularly in Washington, is an understudied topic, any investigation undertaken will aid in the addition of historical and archaeological knowledge. Focusing on both the history of the oyster industry and the Pamlico River, as well as the archaeological data of an unknown vessel, will provide new information to the historical narrative of Washington and North Carolina as a whole. Finally, identifying the vessel type for Site PMR 0062 would also be significant due to the rarity of the possible vessel types. If the vessel is a bugeye, then it would be one of a few confirmed examples of the vessel type in the archaeological record. Similarly, if the shipwreck is a North Carolina variation of the Chesapeake Bay bugeye vessel type, then it would also be significant because this local variation is not documented in the historical record. Whether site PMR 0062 is a bugeye or a local variation of the type, it has both historical and archaeological significance to the maritime cultural heritage of North Carolina. I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my presentation and look forward to answering any questions during the Q&A session on November 7th from 9:45 to 10:45 a.m. Thank you.